Anna Neyzburg, everybody.
How's everybody doing? Do a little better than that. Come on, how's everybody doing? Whose first time is it at Lonestar? Oh, rad! That is awesome. I love it. It's my first time too, actually. I've been meaning to come, so I'm super excited. And my first time in Austin. And Austin seems like a rad town, so I'm super excited to be here. So yeah, my name is Anna. I am a developer at a consultancy called Carbon 5. I work with a lot of companies building custom software, everything from startup through enterprise. We have offices in different parts of the country. It's a great place to work. If anybody's interested, you can talk to me later. I also, a couple years ago, started an organization called Elixir Bridge. We put on free workshops for underrepresented folks in tech to learn Elixir in Phoenix. And we've taken a little break, but we're hoping to ramp up later this month. But a lot of the work I've done has kind of fueled this talk. And with that, I will get started. So that's me, with my mom. In 1989, my family, my parents, who were probably about my age, and me, who was about 2, we immigrated to the US from what was then the Soviet Union as political refugees. And the reason we did that is, although we're not super religious, we're Jewish. And when being Jewish in Russia during that time, you essentially didn't have access to a lot of opportunities. For example, my dad wanted to go to medical school, and that wasn't a thing that was really an option just because that didn't happen if you were Jewish. And we were able to leave because there was a lot of political pressure by the US and Israel to say, okay, well, let the Soviet Jews leave the country and maybe have better opportunities elsewhere. My mom had a friend who lived in San Francisco. You had to have a sponsor, not a fiscal sponsor, but somebody you knew who could kind of vouch for you. And so we came to San Francisco. And what was interesting is that the American Jewish community was super well organized. They had, when we got here, they helped us find housing, they helped me find a daycare, or my parents find a daycare for me, they helped my parents find work, and they partnered us with essentially American Jewish families who were willing to just be there, to answer questions, whether it be like, where do you buy groceries, or how do you set up a bank account, or like, how do I navigate finding a job? They essentially kind of passed down this code of how do you need to function to learn how to successfully exist in this new society that was really foreign to us. So fast forward maybe like 2.5 decades, and now I am about a little younger than my parents were when they came here, and I'm making my own transition into this industry. I don't have a traditional CS background. But I was going to go to medical school, and that didn't pan out. And so I was like, oh, I'm really interested in programming, but really intimidated. There's a lot to learn. And I was talking to some friends about it, and they told me about an organization called RailsBridge, which was actually the inspiration for Elixir Bridge. There happened to be a workshop that following weekend, so I went. And I was really nervous. I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't have a lot of confidence in my skills. But the instructor that taught our class from the moment we entered was so excited and so confident in us and our abilities that by the time the workshop ended, I feel like somehow that confidence transferred, right? I felt all of a sudden so empowered and so capable. And then after that workshop, that evening, we all went to dinner, the TAs, the teachers, and the students, and continued the conversations from that morning, and it felt like I was being given access to this community. I felt really welcome. And even though I couldn't really teach people how to code, or couldn't really even code myself at that point, I was super excited to give back because the experience was so positive. So I started organizing workshops. It was basically cat herding, right, logistics. And there was a workshop that was happening shortly after that at a company, and one of the hosts from that company was a woman who was already pretty well established in the industry. And we got to talking that day because she was there all day. I said, hey, can I talk to you sometime? Can we have coffee? I'm still trying to figure out how to navigate getting into this industry. I don't have a lot of experience. And she said, sure. We had coffee about a week later, talked to her about 2 hours. And her feedback was so valuable. She had really specific feedback around like where the industry was right now. What are the things that I needed to learn? Things that were hard for me to grasp because I didn't have all the context, but ended up being hugely valuable in how I chose to kind of navigate my career. And that coffee turned into many coffees, and now this person's actually one of my most valued mentors. So what's the point, right? How does this immigration story that I just told you tie into like my getting into tech? It seems kind of random. Why does it matter? Well, I've mentioned that I do a lot of work in trying to help build this community. And in that, I've been doing a lot of thinking about how we build community and how that makeup of that community affects the software that we build. And in thinking about the work, and people often come up to me and ask me like, well, what can I do, or how can I do a workshop, or how can I get started? I was thinking a lot about what we can do as individuals. And thinking back to my immigration story, and I'm in no way comparing the complexity of that to like my transitioning to tech, but what I realized is that in building community in general, it's often the small things that go unnoticed to a lot of people that are the big things for somebody else, right? I think about those like American Jewish families that were like there to answer questions that may have been, inconsequential to them, but made a huge impact on us. Or my now mentor, who took the time to talk to me, and it was maybe 2 hours for her, but had a huge impact on what I chose to do and how I chose to be able to navigate my career. Or the student that came up to me after an Elixir Bridge workshop and said, having a teacher that looks like me teach the class was incredibly empowering. And so I've come to realize that kind of those small things build upon each other, and they end up actually being the big things, the things that really matter. And this is a piece that I read a little while ago in Wired. It's not super new, but it really resonated. As software developers, we spend so much time thinking about the small things, right? The code we write every day. And this guy, Paul Ford, who wrote this piece, he said this, right? So much about building software, more than anyone wants to admit, is etiquette. It's rules all the way down. Coders care passionately about the position of the brackets and semicolons. They meet at conferences, on message boards, in private Slacks, to hash out what is good and what is bad. But it also means who is in and who is out. And if you look up etiquette, right, it was basically defined as the customary code of polite behavior in a society. It's a customary code, so we're kind of making up the rules. And success somewhat depends on understanding these somewhat arbitrary rules. And for those people who have been in the industry long enough, who are lucky enough to have learned the etiquette early on, or to even know that there was one, they know how to operate. And we spend so much time thinking about the small things with regard to code. What if we paid just as much attention thinking about the small things with regard to people? So for those of us that have the privilege that are operating in the industry, right, if that piece of understanding is so important, how do we as individuals more effectively pass that on? So I want to take a step back before we talk about that and talk about how we in general as humans make decisions, right? Because this plays a big role in our day-to-day interactions. And this might be a review for some of you, or familiar for some of you, if you have read Thinking Fast and Slow. And again, that's just one perspective, but I find it really interesting. For those of you not familiar, there's a gentleman named Professor Daniel Kahneman. He's from Princeton. He won a Nobel Prize. They're essentially talking about how we think, right? And that he essentially has a different perspective on understanding the human mind. That we have this battle going on between intuition and logic. There's like the deliberate, logical part of our mind. It's capable of analyzing a problem and coming up with a rational answer, right? This is the part of the mind you're aware of. It's expert at solving problems, but it's slow. It requires a lot of energy, and it can be lazy. It was interesting that I read that often just the act of walking is enough to occupy your attentive mind. If any of you have ever thought, if you are ever thinking about a tricky problem and you're walking, chances are you'll stop to actually think about it, because those two acts are actually too much to occupy your attentive mind. And I found this funny because I was actually in Patagonia a couple weeks ago hiking with my dad. and he was hiking in front of me. We were doing a backpacking trip. And I would say something to him, and he would stop, turn around, and say something to me, and then keep walking. And this kept happening. I was like, Dad, just talk and walk. But apparently, that's not how it works. And the other part of your mind, right, it's intuitive, it's fast, it's incredibly powerful, and it actually makes most of our decisions. And we don't even realize that it's happening. So the intuitive part is in control most of the time. And the other interesting thing I found about the intuitive part of the mind as I was doing some research, and again, you can show one study and show another study that disproves it, but I found this piece interesting as a thing to think about. There was a study done and released in Nature magazine a few years ago where they essentially were scanning people's brains. And while they were doing that, they had people watching a screen that was streaming letters, and they had a button in each hand. And those people could press the button on either side anytime they wanted. And then the screen would freeze, and they were asked to remember which letter appeared on the screen. And shortly after they started the activity, they were able to see in the scans which button, right or left, essentially the person would decide to press about 7 to 10 seconds before the person actually decided to press it. And they were able to kind of predict the decision that that person had made before it even entered their awareness. And so it's interesting to think about that sometimes we've already made the decision before we're aware of the fact that we have. And this isn't a problem in and of itself, right? But the problem comes out when we allow this intuitive, fast system to make decisions that really should be made by our slow, deliberate, logical system. And this is when mistakes creep in, right? And we're talking about random mistakes. We're talking about systematic errors that we all make all the time without realizing. And this is a familiar concept to us, right? Essentially, we're talking about bias, right? These are things that affect our beliefs, our opinions, and decisions, and we have no idea that it's happening if we're not paying attention. And there's different kinds of bias, right? There's a thing called present bias where, let's say I offer you half a box of chocolates a year from now, and a box of chocolates a year and a day from now. You'll most likely take the full box of chocolates because the time difference between a year and a day from now is insignificant. But if I offer you half a box of chocolates right now and a full box of chocolates tomorrow, chances are you'll take the half a box of chocolates now because the immediate gratification seems impossible to pass up when waiting another day. And we're all familiar with this one, right? We have confirmation bias. Those of us who have family members that maybe disagree with us on certain topics, politics, I don't know, especially spend time on social media, we look for information that confirms our own thinking. And the other thing that I found interesting in how we think is that humans respond differently to loss than to gain. When we lose something, or when we experience something negative, it affects us twice as harshly as something positive. For example, if you're walking down the street and you lost $10, and then tomorrow you're walking down the street and you found some money, you'd have to find double as much money to offset how you were feeling the other day. So negative experiences weigh more heavily on individuals than positive. And then I start thinking about, well, how deeply rooted are these biases? And there's some interesting research by a woman named Laurie Santos out of Yale who is actually exploring this, how deeply rooted are these? And she taught a troop of monkeys to use money, and she called it monkeynomics. They were able to use tokens to buy treats, and it turns out monkeys also experience loss aversion. This idea of being afraid to lose something, to have a negative outcome. And given that, negative consequences build upon each other, right? Experiencing lots of loss aversion can have a traumatic impact. And given that this is happening in monkeys, and if we're talking about evolution over years and years, then maybe our biases are pretty deeply rooted. But on the positive front, I found this piece really interesting in our thinking. People actually feel really empowered to make decisions when they feel confident. There was an interesting article in the Journal of Physiology, some research done on confidence-related decision-making, where it actually doesn't matter how much information somebody has. They don't feel more confident because they have more details. But they are able to make a decision because they feel more confident. So in the context of community building, who feels welcome now? And often, when I ask this question, I feel like it's the people who already have the privilege, who understand the etiquette, who feel confident making the decisions. Who in this room has ever really been in a space where they felt unwelcome? Any space, doesn't have to be tech, right? I see a lot of hands. So in this industry specifically, there's an organization in the Bay Area, it's called the Kapoor Center, and they did a study in 2017, it was called the Tech Leaver Study. And they found that lots of people, especially folks that were underrepresented, were leaving the industry. And that's not surprising given the news that we see, right? The Ubers and the WeWorks and the Google manifestos. And we pride ourselves on being an industry of like disruption and innovation. But 37% of the people were leaving because they felt like they weren't being treated fairly. Is anybody in here familiar with this term called status distance? Cool. So this is an idea that came out of some research at the Columbia Graduate School of Business by these two women, Catherine Phillips and Melissa Thomas Hunt. And they essentially said that when we have a group of people, we essentially assign them a value when they're in a group, or they assign each other a value when they're in a group. So you imagine you have a group of people, and one group is a majority of one demographic, maybe has one person from another demographic. It's likely that the group that's in the majority will apply a higher value to each other. And so there's a distance between them and the other person. And they argue that status distance among team members really suppresses the assertiveness and the confidence of the people who have essentially a lower status or lower value, and can often obscure their contributions in a group. And given everything we talked about just now about how we think, really sounds like bias. And to move further with that argument, there's actually a term in psychology, fluency heuristics. The more fluently or quickly we process something, the more value we place on it. And given everything we just talked about, it makes sense, right? We're confirming our own bias. If someone is sharing our perspective, right, or has a similar way of thinking, the things that they say are going to make more sense. We're going to process them more quickly, and we're actually going to think they're more valuable. So what happens when someone in the group is speaking who doesn't share our opinions? Harvard Business Review did an experiment. They were looking at a company because they were seeing that at one of these large Fortune 500 companies, men were getting promoted at a higher percentage than women and faster. And they were like, well, I wonder what's different in the women's behavior that's happening. Maybe they're operating differently, maybe they're not getting access as much time to the executives, et cetera. So had the women wear sensors and kind of track their movement and their interactions with their colleagues and their superiors and their clients. And they realized there was actually no difference in behavior. It was the perception of the behavior that was different. So I argue that those who already have the bias lean towards them have a responsibility to help others get access. They are already the folks that feel confident and empowered to make decisions. And we just learned that humans are actually not very good at making decisions. So how do we help people feel welcome? I was just talking the other day to a friend of mine who's thinking about leaving the industry because she's like, oh, this is terrible. And again, we talk about progress and we talk about innovation, but yet we can't solve this problem. Well, I really like this definition of progress. It's from the same person that I was referencing earlier. Why can't progress be the opening of doors, the leveling of opportunity, progress being calmly accepting and thinking of others? And I like this, right? If we can make Bitcoin real, then we can make fairness real. So how do we do that, right? Well, providing an opportunity for folks to enter. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about now are things that like individuals can do, and they seem small, but I've seen it makes a big difference, right? So providing an environment for folks to enter. Think about the last 10 people. You're like, I'm psyched about Elixir. Let me reach out to them and see if they're interested or want to come to this thing or invite them into the community. And what do those 10 people look like? Do they look like you? Do they look like the community you want to see? And if not, who are the next 10 people? And it seems like a small act, but being invited in or being welcomed in can make a big difference. And when people feel welcome, it helps them feel confident. And when they're confident, they're more likely to be able to make decisions, to be able to stay active, to want to be engaged. In our work with Elixir Bridge, again, another thing we can do is we always talk about creating a safe space. Well, how do we do that as individuals, right? That's hard. We're not an organization. And Bruce this morning mentioned, or Justice this morning mentioned, code of conduct, right? Committing to having a positive experience for everybody. Again, it's like, well, yeah, code of conduct. But how many of your companies, if you think about it, you've read theirs? Or your companies have one? And if they don't, are you in a position of enough privilege and seniority where you could actually ask the question and be like, why don't we have this thing? It's kind of important, committing to a safe and harassment-free experience for everybody. And it's really just not just enough to have one, right? Outlining kind of what behavior is expected. And we do this a lot in our workshops. We say things in our workshops, in our code of conduct, that you think we wouldn't have to say, like use your words and respect boundaries, or don't ask anybody out on a date. And that seems really unnecessary, but it makes it really clear what the expectations are so that it's hard for people to behave otherwise. And we even try and clarify kind of the gray areas, like if you say something that you think is going to be appropriate, don't say it. Or everybody has their own normal, and what's normal for you isn't normal for somebody else. You can't define that for somebody else. A lot of these things sound basic, but they're really important because when people feel safe, they don't have to worry about that, then they can be actively engaged and excited. So for those of you who are at companies who are like, oh, we don't have one, maybe ask if you can, or take a look at it and see if it actually makes sense. Especially if you have enough kind of social capital to do that, because not everybody in your organization does. And we want to make sure that everyone is working with the same rules and knows how to navigate the expectations. Another thing is, who knows what happens when something goes wrong? In workshops, and as Justice mentioned today, there's kind of a plan. If something goes wrong, here's what you do. I worked at a lot of companies where I'm like, well, we have a code of conduct, but if something happened, I actually don't know what I would do or don't know how to resolve it. And is that clear? And if not, is it possible for you to be the person to start asking questions to make that more clear? Because when people who have less privilege feel like they have a course of action, again, it just helps them feel more empowered. This is something I talk about a lot. And this seems like something that's also very small, but really important. If we shifted our thinking, day-to-day interaction with our peers, to remind ourselves that everybody has limited knowledge, but infinite potential. Just because somebody doesn't know something now, doesn't mean they won't know it later. It doesn't mean they still don't have valuable contributions to make now. I was just talking with one of my podcast hosts yesterday, and he was telling me he went to a meetup, Papers We Love, and he was one of the 2 people there that wasn't in college. It was started by a senior in college, and they all went around the room introducing themselves. And when it got to him, he was like, oh, I run a consultancy. And he could feel all of the other people's energy in the room kind of just shrink and disregard him because they thought that, oh, well, he's just a manager and he must not know what he's talking about. Until he said, oh, and I actually write code every day, and everybody perked up again, right? The small shift in mindset actually has a visible outcome. It lowers the intimidation factor, and you will see the shift in people's interactions. And the next thing is access, right? How do we help provide access? And I talk about this story a lot. Dave's up there, I see him. I gave a talk at CodeBeam a few years ago about how Elixir makes us better developers because it provides access to these really powerful programming paradigms. And the late Joe Armstrong was also in the room. And Joe was like, who cares if it's hard, as long as the end result is beautiful? And they started arguing, and Dave was like, no, actually, it really matters because it's not as accessible, and it's important for it to be accessible. So what does accessibility mean, right? As an organization, right, we provide, like Elixir Bridge, we provide free workshops, we try to provide childcare, we try to help people get stuff installed in their machines. But what do we do as individuals in an organization? Well, I'd argue, especially to the folks that already have some experience, and again, have some social capital, it's easy, I think, when you're working on a code base, to work through it and to find problems and to just fix them. Be like, oh, I'm working on this thing. Oh, there's this other thing over here. I'm just going to fix that real quick. You already have a lot of visibility in your org. People are already confident in your skills. It takes a little bit more work. But what if you were to pause, and again, not every time, but what if you were to pause and be like, I wonder if I could pass this off as an opportunity for somebody else with a little bit of support, frame it and pass it down to somebody who maybe doesn't have as much experience and doesn't have as much visibility. And it would be a really interesting learning experience for them, and maybe they would get visibility, it would help build their confidence. Again, seems like small things, but can make a really big impact. And language. And we talk about this a lot, but about how much language matters, and things that we often might think are inconsequential. As an example, I was sitting in a meeting last week. There were a couple of senior developers. We work with clients a lot. There was a designer in the room. And we were wrapping up the meeting, and one of the principal developers, who's a good friend of mine, was like to the designer, well, we're rolling into another meeting. He was like, well, you can stay if you want, but we're just going to talk about nerd stuff. And the designer kind of was a little taken aback, but then quietly left the room. And I said to him, I'm like, well, did you just say nerd stuff? And another friend of mine who was in the room, to his credit, said, you mean design nerd stuff, right? Because they're engineering nerd stuff, right? Because there can be design nerd stuff. And again, these things seem small, but it's these small negative interactions that create barriers that then build upon each other and then become the big things, right? It's not the one thing. It's kind of the death by 1,000 cuts, right? That keep happening until you can't deal with it anymore. And the other thing that I have found really valuable is modeling of behavior. For those of you that are already in positions where you're like, yeah, people are confident in your work. Not everyone feels that way, right? And sometimes people are afraid to answer questions. They're afraid to say, I don't know this thing, because the industry has this habit of being like, oh, wait, no, you should know all the things. Just how it works, which is not how it works, right? But if you're not in a position to feel confident, you may not want to ask the questions because you don't want to be perceived as not knowing what you're talking about. So for those of you who already do, can you model that behavior, right? You already have the capital, so ask the questions, right? If you make a mistake, share it. Normalize that behavior. And this last thing that I think has been really valuable, and I've seen it a lot as my career has progressed, is the opportunity to reflect. For example, as an organization in Elixir, after Elixir Bridge workshops, we separate the students and the teachers and we ask them, what went well, like retrospectives, right? What went well, what didn't, what could be better? And where I work now, we do this weekly internally with our teams, with our clients. And again, every organization has a different structure. But is there a way of facilitating some of this, where you create a safe space where people actually feel comfortable voicing the things that have gone wrong? And it's not always technical. It's like, well, I feel like our team hasn't been communicating well this week. Or I feel like out of the loop on this thing. Because then you can catch the small misunderstandings before they build on each other and become a much bigger thing. And on the other hand, you can build upon the positive things. That thing went really well. Or that person and I really appreciate that thing that person did for me. It really helped me understand this thing. And then the positive things build on each other. And then those become the big things. And I get that this stuff isn't easy. And I'm not claiming to have all the answers. And I'm not claiming that all of the things and all of the theories that I presented are, fact or 100% accurate or whatever. But it's one way of thinking. And I know that it takes a conscious effort to do some of these things. But I think this is bigger than just building the community we want to see. Even though we know that that is really important, and we know, even companies know at this point with all the studies, that it actually helps their bottom line. Even just from an engineering perspective. We know that our code is biased because we're biased. And we know, as technology develops, our code grows in complexity, right? It's impossible often for one human to understand all of the implications and decisions that we're making when we write code, especially where it will be several years down the line. And it's impossible to understand beforehand the far-reaching implications of that. And not to be grim, it was 65 degrees in Antarctica last week. I was in Patagonia and I was reading this and I was like, oh my God. And we're gonna have really big problems in the world, like not enough water. And we're not gonna be able to build effective tools if we're not gonna be able to fully understand the problems we're facing or the far-reaching implications of the solutions. And we can't do that unless the folks building the tools reflect the communities facing the problem. But to do that, people need access. And so really, this is a call to action for everyone in this room who already has some privilege in that regard. Taking time to focus on the small things. Language that's inclusive. Figuring out a way to help make the space you're in more safe if you can. Providing opportunities. Figuring out if there's a way to allow people to have a space to reflect. Modeling behavior. And then just maybe, this will actually be our new definition of progress. Thank you.